Welcome back to Take a Leap and Transform, a Neurodiversity journey. I'm your host, Joseph K. Muscat. Are you ready to take a leap with me? As we embark on this journey, let me introduce myself as Malta's Neurodiversity consultant, Joseph K. Muscat. Oh, feedback. Back to Take a Leap and Transform, a Neurodiversity journey. All right. Still technical issues, despite my best efforts. Okay. So let me try again. As we embark on this journey, let me introduce myself as Malta's Neurodiversity consultant, Joseph K. Muscat. I've been pioneering neurodiversity awareness within the Maltese business landscape for the past 3 years. During that time, I've engaged in speaking and coaching and conducting workshops with companies and organizations like Betson, Benna, and AFHIT. This year marks the introduction of Neurodiversity Week to Malta, where we present insights from incredible guests about neurodiversity in the workplace. Now let's leap into our interview. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to day one and our second interview of the day. Through my neurodiversity consultancy, I'm constantly asked, how can we improve the recruitment process? It is one of the biggest challenges faced by human resources and internal and external recruiters, as they often lack awareness, training, resources, and buy-in from all stakeholders involved. This is why I am pleased to be joined by Marc Crawley, a neurodiverse recruitment specialist who will guide us on what we need to know and do. With 17 years in recruitment leadership, Marc Crawley is the founder and director of Diversita. They specialize in neurodivergent-friendly recruitment, aiding jobs seekers and assisting organizations in hiring. Their mission is unlocking potential through tailored recruitment and training. Welcome, Marc.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joseph. I really appreciate the invite to come today.
My pleasure. Well, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you agreeing to be with us. So, Marc, I want to start off with the most obvious question. And let's begin with, what drew you to neurodivergent recruitment?
It's interesting because we talk about this quite a lot, because when we talk to organizations, we always speak about our why we exist and why we do this. And I think for me, I worked in tech recruitment for about 18 years now, 19 years. And particularly near the tail end of my role, or my previous role and the role before that, where I was a director at a couple of quite large recruitment companies, I could see some really prohibitive practices in recruitment in general. And then as my son was getting older, and my autistic son now, he's 16, I kept thinking about what that's going to look like when he goes into the workplace. And I don't want to sound idealistic, but it was genuinely that straightforward. It was a case of, right, I work in recruitment. What's it going to look like for him? And can we try and make a bit of a difference here? And then we looked at organizations that existed that were focused around working only with neurodivergent candidates or neurodivergent job seekers. And I couldn't believe how few there were. There was barely any, right? And particularly with neurodivergent professionals. So it just come about through a variety of things, really. And I think at that point I was keen to move on from my sort of corporate role, and we decided to set up Diversita, really, and first and foremost, to contribute positively to the neurodivergent community, and as a byproduct of that, hopefully to help my son in the future as well.
Well, fascinating. I can see your personal commitment because of your family and your son. And it's really interesting in the aspect, you're kind of right. You have experts who have a background that you can go to or have that experience in regards to that particular field as a recruiter, but there's nobody in regards to, because I guess it's just not on the forefront of their minds in regards to, should we have someone who has a background and specialty, or someone that we can consult with when it comes to recruiting someone with physical or neurodivergent neurological developments?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if you look, so I used to manage, I don't know, when I was at Hayes, I used to manage about 60, 70 people, recruitment consultants in my previous job, a similar amount. And I can count over the 18, 19 years I've been in recruitment, on one hand, the amount of time someone has disclosed any neurodivergence to us as a recruitment agency when I was in my previous roles. So obviously, it was fairly clear that candidates were not comfortable having that conversation with recruitment agents in particular. And then obviously we've since found that they're equally so they're not overly comfortable with disclosing to organisations directly either. So it's really come about from that point where we feel a sense of responsibility to be a mediator between organisations that are really open to neurodivergent talent and neurodivergent candidates, and being that conduit where we can have a really detailed understanding conversation with candidates and then introducing them to our clients and making that a really positive experience is something that we, again, feel a sense of responsibility about. But I think the final thing I'd say is that we were really keen on making sure that we didn't do this with all heart, right? This had to be practical change. And there's a lot of great organizations that give holistic advice and training, etc. But we wanted to be an organization which really tried to change the employment possibilities for neurodivergent individuals. So yeah, it's all really come about now, and we're 2 years in. So it's moving in the right direction, but a lot of work to do.
Before we get into the next question, you've been at this for 2 years now.
Yeah.
And of course, you have 17 years experience. So just from basically a startup perspective and from a startup perspective, I guess, what has been the reception from a candidate and employers in regards to specializing in neurodivergent recruitment?
So I'm trying to say this without sounding, again, maybe too positive, because there's a lot of change that needs to be done. But our candidate community, it genuinely makes me a bit emotional, right? Because we've been so welcomed and so embraced, and we have so many advocates, and for people that we haven't actually managed to find a role for, and they still support what we do and what we're trying to do. So from the job seeker community, it's been fantastic. We are obviously, we don't get everything right as a startup business, and for an organization that's trying to do something that very, very few do. But it's been incredibly positive, and equally so organizations. And we work with about 30 companies in different ways now. And that's been fantastic. And it's very rare that a company doesn't want to have a conversation with us to see what we're doing, again, because we're so unique. Now, we have managed to try and build a business in one of the most challenging economic climates in recent history, right? But even outside of that, we have not strayed away from the things that I believe we need to do to try and make a positive difference. And that's staying in that recruitment lane as much as we can. So, but the response is fantastic. I do think we try to contribute a lot. About 30% of what we do is pro bono or corporate and social responsibility focused. We have a monthly community meetup, for example. We had a mentoring program for a while. We give a lot of free advice. I work as an enterprise advisor for a series of schools in central London. So we do try and always make sure that we don't just... We're not just there to assist neurodivergent professionals who are looking for a role. We're there to try and at least signpost advice for anyone who approaches us.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And definitely a lot of hard work you're doing, and rightly so, because it's still a new field, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. And I mean, when you look at the idea just of adjustments alone and the idea of adjustments, and then changing recommendations like the recent Buckland report, it's a moving landscape, hopefully in the right direction. But there's no doubt that the type of advice and the type of direction we can give to organizations is changing all the time. But equally so, and rightly so, candidate expectations are changing now about the type of experience they want during an interview in a role. And we feel that sense of responsibility when a candidate discloses to us, that we try to make sure that they have, even if they don't get a job, they enjoy their encounter with Diversita. So.
Fantastic. So, Marc, let's move on to my next topic. And it may not seem directly related to recruitment, but revolves around having the right mindset. Over the years, I've observed the attitude that suggests we are too small. We don't have the resources as large establishments, or it's just too difficult to be neuro-inclusive. From your experience, Marc, could you comment on this matter and share how you would address this.
So I absolutely 100% could not disagree more with that sentiment, right? And then the reason, I'll tell you the reason why, particularly in the recruitment space. If I look at recruitment for an enterprise size organization, right? So a large company with, say, five to 10,000 employees, the touch points within a recruitment process alone are incredibly challenging. The touch points in terms of the opportunity for bias, or the amount of people that you need to try and bring it onto the, I suppose, to try and change is incredibly difficult. It's like trying to turn a battleship, right? Whereas smaller organizations that we have experience with, particularly organizations that are less than 100 people, they're not driven or held to certain standards within operational processes within the organization, like including recruitment, which means they're more pliable, more easy to change, more receptive to that. And then if you have someone within an organization of that size, or a small organization, who's purpose-minded or has a personal association with neurodiversity, or they're keen to try and make changes, then that's incredibly powerful. It really is. And it's far easier for that to resonate throughout the organization than trying to literally chip away at a company that's huge. So, yeah, I think the most success we've had in terms of the ratio of individuals that are now bought into neuroinclusion is much better within smaller organizations. And the key last thing I'd say on that as well is that when we're talking around neuroinclusion, we're talking about changes. Most of these are incredibly low cost, if any cost at all. It's often a change of mindset, it's a change of processes, it's just being receptive and empathetic in certain parts of the business, including recruitment. So, yeah, sorry if I ranted there, but that's the smaller organization, large organization one has heard a few times. So, yeah, it's a good question.
So, thank you. So, what you're saying then with smaller organizations, is it because they haven't developed that bureaucracy due to their size?
It's a fair point. Absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, if I look at the success we have within large companies tends to be within a team within that organization, as opposed to the whole organization. Whereas the smaller companies we work with, where it's not perfect, right, with a lot of them, but it's so much easier to get something signed off, so much easier to make a change to the interview process, so much easier to communicate that process to someone in HR, talent acquisition, and then the interviewers within the business, because you're not talking around hundreds, maybe thousands of managers or people leaders or interviewers. Then you're talking about a dozen, right? Maybe 15. So for me, smaller organizations are the companies we will love to work with the most. We really are, because once it's embedded with a company that size, as they do grow, that culture is already part of it, and it grows in the right way. So yeah, and again, cost is very really a factor, particularly when you have areas like access to work and navigating that in the right way. And so yeah, I don't think costing is or I suppose it's more about the appetite a lot of the time.
Right. So it's kind of like, I guess the best way to put it is kind of the size or the size of the company is about the sweet spot. That sweet spot where they're able to be, just to pick up the phone or walk down the corridor to have a conversation with the decision maker and say, here's the idea, do we go for it or not? And they say, yeah, let's do it. And then within a matter of 24 hours, they're doing it, versus with a bigger corporation, it's, well, we have to have a meeting, we have to talk to this department and that department, we have to talk to this VP or this director before we can kind of make any kind of decision. That could be months of conversation before anything, if anything at all, gets done.
Absolutely. Even something relatively simple like questions in advance, right, for a neurodivergent candidate. With a smaller organization, if there's a few key-minded people that understand the concept of equality versus equity, and they have the power to make change relatively quickly, then straight away our job seekers are getting a far more positive experience. You have that conversation at another organization, the level of sign-off there that needs to be washed through. And not only that, even if it is embedded through, say, in the recruitment team, it's then going to potentially get resistance from the business, or potentially resistance from the ever-changing amount of interviewers that are in there. So I'm not saying organizations can't make change that are of a certain size when they're bigger, but it just takes a little bit longer.
Right.
So yeah, so to answer your first question, if you've got a decent sized company and you're looking to make this, then don't let any areas like cost or you're too small put you off.
Fantastic. Now, before we move on to the next question, Marc, again, when we talk about size and talk about, how more flexible a smaller companies versus a larger company, with the companies that you've worked with, out of curiosity, do they have internal HR or they don't have internal HR?
I'd say I'm saying 30. I think it's probably a little bit more than that now, but it's around 30. Say 30 companies we work with. I'd say 25 of them have internal HR. But even internal HR doesn't tend to be the obstacle if the company is a decent size. In fact, it can really help because it can extrapolate that message out in a structured way. So yeah, most of them have an internal HR team. Yeah.
And what about out of the 5 that don't? Are there particular challenges? And I ask this because we have companies that are of 100, sometimes of 200 or less than 100, where they don't have HR. And of course, incorporating the concept of being neuro-inclusive is a very far thing that's not even on their radar.
So I think out of the others, I think 3 of them are very small. And talking honestly, they're owned by neurodivergent individuals, right, who are keen to try and make a change. So the purpose is already embedded there. So
right.
You haven't got the obstacle of why we do this at that point. You've got more the obstacle of, okay, how do we do this? The other 2 organizations that don't have HR, they still only have a relatively small number of managers, and we've done line manager training at a couple of those 2 organizations. So and I think both of those are about 60, 70 people. So I think one of them had 6 managers, the other one had 8 or something like that. So again, you can get under the skin of people doing the interviews at that point very, very quickly. And I think, again, it's not really about sometimes the HR process. It's about when an application comes in to your organization, what do you do if you see that someone discloses, right? What is your first instinct? What are your actions after that? If someone asks for adjustments, do you understand why? And I think we try to make sure we educate anyone who's involved in that initial screening, be it direct, be it a founder, be it HR, be it talent acquisition, around that concept of making sure that you understand why these things are being asked for.
Okay, so what I'm hearing then is if you're a company that doesn't have an HR, it basically comes down to mindset, education, training, and overcoming biases.
I would say that's a fairly good list. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, and you're right. Mindset comes with appetite and willingness. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So earlier today, Marc, I had a discussion with Noel De Bono from FHRD. FHRD are Malta's local foundation for human resource and development.
Okay.
And our conversation focused on securing buy-in from board level, emphasizing the importance of leadership support for neurodivergence. In your experience with working various companies, obviously with HR and without HR and so forth, how is this aspect typically addressed?
So it's particularly with large organizations, I think this is really important and really key. So we work with a few of the large professional services companies, and I won't mention names, but buying from people that, how can I say, people who hold the purse strings and the influence to try and make change is incredibly important. So even if the individual in the leadership position isn't neurodivergent themselves, but they obviously can understand the benefit for the organization but also the benefit for the candidates and the job seekers that are approaching the organization, and of course the employees that work in there. If someone's got the ability, the influence and the power to do that, then it's incredibly important. It really is. It is. even more so organizations where someone is themselves neurodivergent in that position because of the representation within companies. But you can't underestimate the importance of people driving this, because a lot of the time it's outside of the existing process or outside the existing standard or outside the existing framework. So yeah, to answer that question, I couldn't agree more. Particularly with large companies.
So in that regards, then, when you're facing barriers from board level, coming in as a consultant and recruiter, being they're being your client, how do you, and what would you suggest to tackle this particular issue?
So when we approach companies at the moment, when we have conversations, it's normally for a variety of subjects, right? But they tend to be these. The first one tends to be, this is a nice thing to do, right? As in, it's good to welcome neurodivergent job seekers and applicants, or make sure that we create a nice environment for our employees. It's a nice thing to do. Other people do it because they believe, do you know what? This is legislative, as in this is could be a HR concern. They do it from a position of fear, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The companies that look at it and think, you know what, this is genuinely going to add value to our organization in so many ways, right? Including the bottom line and the commercial reasons. That's, I think, where, when we're trying to get influence, sometimes from the business, the conversation is its most powerful. Right? When we start to say, okay, you're really missing out here on a different way of thinking. You're really missing out on a candidate pool that is largely passive because of prohibitive recruitment processes. You're largely missing out here on having an environment full of so much diversity, where it's going to be fantastic for everyone. Now, all you've got to do is do a few of these things, and it's a great positive step for you. And do you know what? If you do that, suddenly you're going to realize that nearly 15% of your population are neurodivergent because they start putting their hands up. So it can sometimes start with a commercial conversation around this. Now, we always make it clear to companies that it's not just, you don't just suddenly have all of these strengths. You need to make accommodations to sometimes see these and make changes to your environment. But I don't think people should be concerned about having a commercial conversation, particularly with people that's the language they know.
Yeah, that's interesting. The language they know. I mean, because we had the same conversation with Noel in regards to, or a similar conversation where businesses are focused on the purse strings, right? You know, what's the bottom line? They're not so much focused on the people. And it's trying to make that connection that the purse strings are actually dictated by the people that you're employing, as well as you're missing on an opportunity to grow your business even more so, because you're not tapping into those strengths because you're not as inclusive as you think that you are.
Absolutely. And I think that the idea of cost, or the idea of it being the right commercial decision to embrace neuroinclusion within your environment is something that, yeah, we have quite a lot with people. But you're absolutely, because it can stop people leaving, for example, right? So suddenly you start creating a better environment. You start seeing better output from individuals. People feel more comfortable at work. They can bring a larger part of themselves to work, and they don't leave. And then they don't go to your competitors, right? And suddenly you've got to spend another 20, 30 grand replacing someone. So all of these areas are the type of conversations we sometimes have. But I would still say that most of the senior partners or senior business representatives tend to focus on this area because of a personal association with neurodiversity initially. So be it they have a neurodivergent child, or be it that a member of their family is neurodivergent, and then they start to see it from that perspective first, then they can see the commercial benefit to making sure their organization really, really supports this going forward.
Gotcha. So, Marc, I want to now touch upon both internal and external recruitment.
Okay.
I find it valuable to explore both approaches as well. They share the common objective of filling roles and placing candidates, yet their motives differ. So let's break this down. What are the initial challenges faced by both internal and external parties when entering the realm of neurodivergent recruitment?
So it's a really interesting question because if you look at external recruitment, so are you talking about recruitment agencies in this part?
Yes.
Yeah. So recruitment agencies have such a big responsibility, right? Because just keeping it quite simple, their job is to send a fair representation of the candidate market to their clients for consideration, right? So they will talk to some even a consultant used to work for me, probably used to talk to dozens and dozens of candidates and then decide they're going to send their favorite 3 candidates to an organization. So that challenge there about who is making that decision to send those candidates, what those 3 that go out of the 50 to 100 candidates that a recruitment consultant talk to, that's an enormous challenge for a recruitment company to overcome, because in there's so much potential for bias, right? And there's so much potential for discrimination and so much potential for localized decision making. So that, for me, is one of the biggest challenges recruitment agencies have, because they're driven by different standards. They're driven by making sure they keep their clients happy. They're driven by making sure that they send what they consider the best candidates. But their consultants are driven by commission, right, and making sure that they can earn money for making placements with organizations. And that is a challenge. That really is. It really is. The flip side, then, you then start putting in a recruitment agency or recruitment agents working for a big company having to have a conversational level of understanding around neurodiversity and making sure that they give a great candidate experience to people coming through. That's almost unmanageable for a lot of recruitment agencies, particularly if they're getting a lot of pressure from organizations to get talent over quickly and get candidates over quickly. So I think it's really interesting. This is why we exist, right? To make sure that the candidates do have that positive experience with a recruitment agency. There's some brilliant recruitment agencies out there that do try their best to drive inclusion, but are also dictated by their clients in terms of the focuses. And for a number of years now, it's been gender diversity or driven around ethnicity diversity. So there's a lot of different areas that the recruitment agents have to focus on. So for me, that's the biggest challenge for external recruitment agencies.
So then, based on what you said in regards to external, what can you suggest in 1 to 3 steps that are suggestions that you can give them to try to be as inclusive as they possibly can?
I think one of the areas that I so wish we'd focused on in the past was when our candidate market was incredibly candidate short, right? As in, there were not enough candidates for roles, right? And that will happen again maybe in the next 1 to 2 years, where we'll have this massive digital skills gap, that we did not proactively put ourselves out there as a recruitment agency that were happy and would embrace neurodivergent talent, right? Embrace those type of conversations and spent a lot of money and time and training trying to educate the recruitment consultants that work for us around this, even if it was one small team, right, that did this, right, in a particular area, that we could see, okay, let's see what happens here, right? Because I think there's a recent report, particularly in tech, around, I think it's around 45 to 53% of existing tech teams may be neurodivergent in the tech talent chart report. I think it's a bit higher. I think it's probably closer to around 30%, but it's still an incredibly large number. So recruitment agencies would be foolish, I think, to not embrace 30% of their candidates coming through and try and create a welcoming outward message, right? So be it on their job adverts, be it on their websites, be it about the information they're putting on social media. So I think they need to make sure that they say neurodivergent candidates are welcome, and we work with companies to make sure that you're given a positive candidate experience. So that would be my number 1 tip for other recruitment agencies, because we can't do all this ourselves, right? So, yeah.
So let's now flip the narrative to internal recruitment. What are the particular challenges that they're facing?
So this might be a little bit controversial, but I think internal recruitment teams certainly in our experience, are actually quite purpose driven for a lot of the time. They're quite keen to make sure their candidates have a really, really positive experience. But I think they struggle with two key areas, right, at the moment. First one is volume, as in the volume of applications they get directly. So if they're not using an external agency, and particularly at the moment where the market is quite job short, they probably get a lot of applications to try and manage. The other big obstacle, and we've touched on this already, is, okay, we've got a candidate who's come in, they disclosed, we've taken their adjustment requests on board, we've advised them some adjustments, we then go to the business and they're like, well, why have I got to do that? Right? Why have I got to give someone more time? Right? Or I've got another 6 candidates here. So if this person joins, suddenly this person wants to work from home one day, more a week, etc. And he's trying to get over that mindset in the business, I think. So managing their internal stakeholders is a key challenge for me. But then managing volumes is as well. And I think this is why it's good to make sure that you work on your applicant tracking systems and you work on areas to make sure that candidates do have the opportunity to disclose, but have a workflow that makes sure that candidates know that their application is being looked after. And that if they do disclose, there's something that gives them a lot of support afterwards. So I could talk about that part all day long, right? But I think they're probably the two biggest challenges for internal recruitment teams that I see.
Okay, that's really interesting. The volume and the mindset. So again, that comes down to educating and overcoming those biases, as we discussed earlier. So when we take a look at the internal and external recruitment, what are they getting right?
So I think the internal teams that we deal with that have a really robust, structured, but flexible process for neurodivergent job seekers and applicants is really important. And what I mean by that, for example, is if someone, for example, discloses that they're autistic, right? Some of the companies I see now, by default, they'll say, fantastic. So what we can offer you is this, right? We can offer you an interview remote first. We can offer you a detailed instruction of what the first interview is going to be, including questions in advance. We can offer, we make sure that we send you a list of areas around what the interview is going to focus on, and maybe some of the logistical explanations about if it's in office, what the location looks like, where you wait, what the person's going to look like, etc. Is there anything else we can help with? You can't underestimate how powerful that is for a candidate to receive that type of conversation. So getting that process right is really important, but it has to then obviously link to make sure that the business understand why that's being offered as well. So being able to offer adjustments as opposed to just reacting to adjustments, I think is incredibly important, incredibly important. Sorry, did you want to say?
No, go ahead.
External recruitment agencies, I think just putting out messages to the candidate market that you're open to neurodivergent candidates. I've touched on this already, but it's so important. But do some training, right? Do some training. It always strikes me as strange that recruitment agencies don't do more training around this. Even when I was there, and again, I wish I was part of the problem, right? So I can't say too much, but I should have made sure that we had more training around all levels of diversity, because we are talking to so many candidates. At one point, if I had a team of 60, right, Joseph, mate, they were talking to, say, 20 candidates a day each, right? So I don't even know what that is. That's probably 1,200 candidates a week, I think, from memory. So over the course of a month, right, what is that? That's nearly 5,000 candidates that my company are talking to. And we never had one person disclose that they were neurodivergent, right? And that's just one team, right? I used to have a load of colleagues that used to manage big teams as well. So it would make sense to be able to make sure that anyone who has that access to job seekers has a level of understanding around most of the diversity pillars, even to a conversational level. I'm not saying everyone has to be an expert on everything, right? But understanding what autism is or what ADHD is, understanding the type of request that we get would have made such a difference. It really would. So companies that are doing that, and there's a few good ones out there that are starting to embrace this, is really important.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and also thank you for saying it, because I meet with a lot of recruitment agencies, or at least try to, not as many as I would like to. And there's always this resistance. They're not
Really?
they're not open to understanding the situation and what they need to do to have that awareness and education, because they're potentially leaving out a huge amount of talent that they're not supporting and not introducing to their clients.
I totally agree. And I think I think it might have been KPMG. I heard a report around a few months ago that they said, I think within the next 2 years or next 3 years in the UK, technical roles, so IT roles at the moment are around 1.5 million roles in the UK. In the next 3 years, it's likely to be around 3.5 million, like because of the introduction of more cloud architecture and AI and all of these other incredible technical advances. So there's no doubt at that point that there's going to be a candidate shortage, right? Yeah, we're talking around 71% of autistic adults in the UK being unemployed. Now, not every autistic adult is going to want to go into IT and data. I get that, right? But it says a lot that I think around 30 to 40% of neurodivergent adults are unemployed at the moment. So there's a huge potential candidate pool there that recruitment agencies should be trying to attract going forward, and building relationships now, not when it's the other time. Do it now, right? Because now's the time to make sure you start building up that candidate pool and the trust within your organization. So yeah, but it doesn't surprise me you get resistance, because I would have probably been the same, mate. I'll be honest. Back in the day, well, I've got all these other focuses, I've got targets, I've got this, etc. So
yeah, no, I'm not surprised either. But like I said, thank you for saying it, because it puts a spotlight on it, and it puts a spotlight on these agencies to realize that if they want to be relevant to their clients and they want to be relevant to the candidates they're serving, that they need to level up.
Absolutely 100%. It is. And I think, again, any leaders within those organizations, or any organization that has a decent level of foresight about, okay, where are the candidate pool of the future coming from? But do you know what? Just go on TikTok for more than 20 minutes and look at is it Gen Z and the new generation coming through. People are far more open around talking around their neurodivergence. And that candidate pool coming through is going to have, and quite rightly so, much more of an expectation around, okay, what can you offer me in terms of support? And if you offer me this, I know I can contribute this. So it's important that organizations start to think that way.
Granted, not granted. Absolutely agree.
I'll take granted. That's good.
Thank you. So, Marc, one of the primary challenges that often goes unnoticed is the creation of non-inclusive job advertisements, which you refer to as the element of outbound marketing. And I totally agree with that statement. Could you elaborate on the aspect of the job advert and outbound marketing, and explain why these represent the initial barriers faced by many neurodivergent individuals?
Oh, mate, I could go and listen. You're going to get me started now. So if I look at job specifications produced by organizations, now there's some brilliant specifications that go out, and there's a big difference here between job adverts and job specifications. I'm just going to, and I'll explain why in a second. So if I'm a company and I produce a job specification, what process is that specification going through? Right. And a lot of the time it's very, very little. Right. It's a localized team will go to HR and say, can you put this on the website? Right. And it's a cut and paste. It's been poorly thought out. It's full of subjective requirements. And I saw one advert recently which said, we want a candidate with a great sense of humor. Right. I mean, what does that even mean? So, but even areas like we want great communication skills, I don't actually have a problem with that being used as long as it's got context, as in we want great communication skills because of this. And the type of communication we're looking at here is verbal, et cetera, et cetera. So it needs elaboration. But a lot of the time, there's very little scrutiny around what that looks like. The best job specifications we see focus on skills, particularly in our sector, and less around culture, less around we want real go-getters here, or it's an incredibly fast-paced, high-powered environment. And if there's emphasis around some of the great work they do in terms of social groups, etc., just make it clear it's really optional. Right? So I could talk about job specs all day. However, job adverts are even worse because a lot of the time their job adverts are a translation of a job specification by someone in HR or a recruitment agency that take that and then translate it to and put it on Indeed or put it on Reed or put it on Diversita. And what standards are being held there around neuroinclusion or around trying to make sure that we're not talking about anything that's a cut and paste job? Again, one terrible phrase, right? But a lot of the time it is. And I used to think about the consultants who used to work for me. They couldn't wait to get an advert out, right? And they would just take a quick cut and paste, change a couple of things to maybe anonymize it and then put it out. So these are not being thought out, but they are so important. They're like the shop window to your organization. You think how much money Selfridges spend every year on their windows, right? And organizations spend about 10 minutes worrying about job specs and job adverts. And because of that, so many candidates won't apply because that does not speak to them. It does not speak to them. And so it's an incredible problem, but it's so simple to fix.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm just thinking, I'm going to go in reverse here. You mentioned the window displays. My wife used to work in merchandising and doing window displays. Okay. And basically doing window displays is the next highest level you can get before reaching management. That's so important to making sure that those window displays look pristine, artistic, because it's what draws people into the stores. Absolutely. And it's a perfect analogy that you use in regards to the job advert, because it's what draws people to organizations. It's how organizations are going to find that great talent that they're looking for. And I always argue that when I read a job advert, I don't know if they're writing an essay or it's the first chapter to their book, because it's like the amount of ridiculous information that's in there. And the language that is so vague. I mean, you started off at the beginning with, must have a great sense of humor. Well, what does that have to do with the job, and what the hell does that mean? Absolutely. Like, what's the context? Explain it. And if you have, a neurodivergent who's highly qualified and sees that has to have a great sense of humor, they're not going to apply.
They don't. And it paints a picture. And we communicate with around 150 to 200 job seekers a month at the moment. So we're starting to gather some really, really good data. And there's no doubt, particularly with autistic job seekers that we speak to, that a lot of people will paint a picture based around the job specification and the job advert around certain areas. So if you see that, it's like, well, it sounds like an environment that doesn't take itself very seriously. I'm just quite keen to do my job because I'm really good at it, but I'm not sure if I'm going to fit in, which means that I need to mask more. And then suddenly there's a domino effect where they're like, I'm just not applying, right? But how often does that happen? Now, I'm not saying that every autistic individual will be put off by that type of language in job specifications, but I think it's important to be mindful. And a lot of companies now put their job specifications through sort of a gender neutral program where it takes away language which is maybe going to create biases, particularly for women. So looking at it and trying to think, okay, where can we be a little bit more careful here? But really, it just comes down to trying to remove as many subjective requirements as possible, and just looking, okay, what is, like you said already, what is fundamentally needed to do this job? And that's so important. That's so important. So, but then equally so, companies need to do spot checks with the recruitment agencies they work with to make sure their translation of their jobs is going out there and it's encouraging people to apply, particularly neurodivergent candidates.
Yeah, and then there also comes the aspect of needs versus wants. Yes. And a lot of times the wants gets in the way of the needs, and it goes even beyond what the job is actually what the job actually requires.
It's a great point, actually. Yeah, I didn't even think of that, because you're right. A lot of our candidates are put off by the nice to haves because they think, oh, there's going to be so many people applying that have not only got all these, but they're going to have these as well. So I'm not going to apply. Let's think about what you actually really genuinely has to be included to fundamentally do this job right on day one, right? Yeah. Doesn't mean that you can't sometimes have conversations during the interview about some things that may be slightly outside of that, but let's draw people into this role and have a conversation, because you're going to miss out on talent if you don't.
Yeah, yeah. And did you get a chance to read last week's publication of the City and Guile's second index report?
No, I've not seen that actually. No, it's been like report season at the moment, so
Yeah,
I'm working my way through about 3 or 4. But no, I've not seen that.
Well, yeah, Neurodiversity Week's usually when these reports come out, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So it's the second one coming out, and they had a section on recruitment. And I want to share this with you and get your insights before we move on to the next question. 1 in 3 have reviewed job descriptions. So going back to what you said earlier, 52% of organizations have reported having adapted the recruitment process, and 44% have neo-inclusion strategies.
Okay.
What's your take on that?
So when you say 1 in 3 reviewed job descriptions, as in they've reviewed the process for building job descriptions?
That wasn't clear on that. It was more on, from what I recall, 1 in 3 have reviewed job descriptions, as in this job description is neo-inclusive.
Right. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, it probably sounds higher than I expected it to be, as well. Equally so, the other statistics, particularly 44% have neuro-inclusion strategies. I suppose, again, it depends on what that means, right?
Yeah.
Does it mean that, yeah, if someone asked for adjustments, then we might consider it, right? That could be considered a neuro-inclusion strategy, right? But I think it just depends on what it looks like in detail. But there's no doubt it seems to be on more organizations' ED&I initiatives this year, which is really encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right in the sense of the more awareness, but then of course, what does that look like? Have they created a procedure and strategy for that, or is it just, okay, someone needs accommodations during the interview process, just provide it, without really thinking about it?
Yeah, definitely. You suppose you could argue there's a difference between a process and the strategy as well, and I think, but it is encouraging. I mean, we had the Buckland report released a couple of weeks ago in the UK, which is really there to drive changing the horrendous statistics around unemployed autistic individuals.
Yeah.
And it's great to see that for whatever reason, organisations are starting to embrace it a little bit more. So I actually look at these, and apart from the job description one, the other 2 statistics I find quite encouraging that more organisations are starting to embrace. But again, the devil's in the detail, right?
Yeah.
And this is why we think recruitment is so important, because it ultimately, it's quite an easy measurable. Okay, how many neurodivergent individuals are disclosed and how many people have you hired? Right? It could be that straightforward sometimes.
Yeah, true. So one of your key concerns and focuses in the application process and interview stage, which you term as the domino effect. Why is this stage so important to get right? And what is the domino effect?
So we use the domino effect analogy for a couple of areas. I think, first of all, we relate it to disclosure. So if a candidate discloses, what happens after that? Right, and it's a really simple question to ask for organisations, and we get people looking all stressed and stuff when they try and answer it because they don't want to get it wrong. And it's a case of, okay, it doesn't matter, right? We're here to try and solve this challenge, but what actually happens? So when someone discloses, what's the domino effect from that point onwards in terms of, okay, what can we offer? What does that look like? How do we engage with the candidate? What information is provided? What conversations happen with the business, etc., etc. Right. So I think, first of all, it's around that. What we then find is that the domino effect in our book translates to, okay, so you now have the business engaging with job seekers that have disclosed. What needs to be done now? Right, in terms of training, etc. Right, so you're almost doing situational problem solving here, but it's based around the fact that you've started to do this at the start of the process, right? So it's starting to fall into place. So you have a challenge there. So then the business starts to embrace neurodivergent job seekers and understand why adjustments are being asked for, and they really start to understand neuro inclusion. But then what you find is organisations then obviously hire some exceptional neurodivergent candidates, but they find out they haven't got an access to work process, right? Or they find that they haven't got some of the right support mechanisms in place in terms of training, communication styles, making sure they're flexible hybrid working policies, whatever it is. So it has an effect from that point onwards. So when you've started right here and over in the recruitment process, it's created this domino effect of change. And I will say this to companies that don't feel you need to get everything perfect. It can be situational change, right? And it can be almost, I won't say learning on your feet, because we don't want people to have a negative experience, but it's really important that companies react quickly to this. And then what happens then is it continues to extrapolate throughout the business. Okay, this team has done brilliant. They've got some great people within that environment. The team looks happy. The engagement's great. All the metrics are looking good. What are they doing? Right? And let's have a look at it from that point onwards. So I think just getting the application stage right is really important. But the final thing I'll say on that is when someone does disclose the application stage, and particularly when a candidate is through the advanced stages of the interview process, where it's fairly likely they are going to get the job, what process do you have then to make sure they get support when they land? Right? Be it, say, for example, they're dyslexic, what tools ideally will they need? Grammarly or Dragon Dictate or any of these areas, can they be installed on day one so someone has a really good landing experience? If someone's autistic, and they've requested a job coach throughout the process, why not provide them a job coach when they start as well? So that sort of domino effect, or that sort of almost, if someone discloses here and it just creates a crescendo of change throughout environments, for me is so important. It really is. And we see it. It's not perfect, but it's getting there.
Oh, it's really interesting because what you've described is coming from a statistic that most candidates decide within the first 90 days whether or not this is the job for them during the onboarding process, and vice versa for companies. And within that first 90 days, either they're going to stay or they're going to leave.
Yeah, I agree.
So so that's a more general perspective. So when we narrow that down towards neurodivergence, you may have gotten the recruitment process right, but once they enter and during that onboarding process, if all the things that you mentioned are not being considered and being put in place, then within that 90-day period, that candidate's going to decide that, this isn't as an inclusive environment as it was at the very beginning. So it's very important to get that time frame done correctly.
Without doubt. And I think even more so, it means that how important the synergy between the talent acquisition, recruitment, and HR team and the business is, that it's part of that creating a general experience for someone, because they're all intertwined in trying to make sure that 90 days is as great as it can be when a candidate lands within an organization. But it sometimes surprises me that companies do some great work in the recruitment and they seem to forget all of that once a candidate starts. And it's like, well, they're not detached, they're intertwined here. But again, it's a process, right? And I think I always say to companies, don't not hire neurodivergent candidates out of fear, right? We can help navigate this. We can help you introduce organizations that help navigate this, because the benefits for the candidate, the benefits for your organization far outweigh the few changes and modifications that you'll need to make.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of conversations with directors, and sometimes quite often, because there's just a lack of depth in their awareness and knowledge of the area,
really,
is that it comes down to, we are very inclusive, and then it comes down to they need to do their job. And yeah, of course they need to do the job, but that's not the question or the issue. The issue is what barriers are in place that are interfering with them being able to do their job. And have you looked and considered what those barriers are, and what are you doing to rectify those barriers? And when you look at, if you got the recruitment stage done properly, and then they enter a team with a manager, the manager's looking at the aspect that they need to do the job, but has the manager been trained to be aware of their neurodiversity? Have they been informed that the individual is neurodivergent and what accommodations they may need? This all has that again, back to that domino effect.
Without doubt. And we see that quite often where candidates come to us and they're having a really, really negative experience with their existing organization, and very early on. And a lot of it is because those expectations just haven't been managed, or they'll say, like, again, we get sometimes an autistic individual will come to us and say, look, the communication style doesn't work for me. I don't actually know what I'm being asked to do here, because it's along the lines of, yeah, look, just have a look at this and let me know your thoughts tomorrow. But if not tomorrow, maybe the day after. And it's not clear, right? There's not a framework there to say a very, very simple what and when, right? This is what I want to know. What do you want me to do and when do you want me to do it, right? And a lot of managers still, based around pre-existing beliefs around leadership or lazy management styles, or just generally being unaware, they don't provide that type of direction.
Yeah, communication is a huge factor. Clear, precise, and being specific. And a lot of managers haven't grasped that aspect of communication, where it's just vague and they expect people to read between the lines or read their minds, right? And it doesn't work that way with anybody, but in particular with neurodivergence.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I think, so again, making sure that candidates just have that really positive introduction to organizations is just, it's priceless. And we work with companies to provide support through onboarding coaches, and we recommend that for the first 12 weeks, most of our candidates meet with an onboarding coach or a job coach for once a week. It can sometimes be someone just to vent to, right? Or someone you can be a bit of a conduit between getting something sorted. So we find that really useful.
Well, that's interesting. That's a really good segue. And I want to be conscious of our time. So I hope you can stay on just a little bit longer, Marc.
Yeah, of course.
Because this is a good segue. And we've mentioned this a number of times during our conversations, which brings us to accommodations, because coaching is accommodation. In fact, later this week on Friday, we have Dragan Dumkov, who's a coach who's worked with ADHDers, and we're going to be talking about the importance of integrating coaching into the workplace, because it is one of the top accommodations. So on the topic of accommodations, Marc, accommodations tends to be a trigger word during both the interview stage and in the workplace. This is closely tied to the concept of equity, which is another term that it can be challenging for organizations to grasp. Understanding the significance of these terms, why are they required, and how to implement them can be complex. Could you address these trigger words?
So I always use I use an analogy, right, with organizations when I talk to them, because of my journey in recruitment, which has been, I think I said 17 years on the website. I think it's nearer 19 years now. So when I first started in recruitment, it was what I would call handshake recruitment, right? So if we talk about this from a recruitment perspective, where people would, I don't know, I used to recruit for some large financial institutions, used to go on the trading floor, the tech floor, and everyone looked like me, right? Not me 20 years ago, me now, right? So it was very much a case of who you knew. There was very little process. It was teams moving from one area, team to another, one bank to another, or one organization to another. And there was very little in the way of equality, right, in terms of the process. Then predominantly pushed through by gender equality coming, right, in predominantly around 2010, where people had the opportunity to have the same application process experience, right, or the same opportunity to apply for roles, right, and everyone was treated equally for a recruitment process. We now have a situation where that's not fit for purpose, right? And equity is incredibly important, because obviously not everyone has the same starting position. And organizations understanding that, for example, giving an autistic job seeker questions in advance is not making neurotypical candidates be at a disadvantage, because I cannot tell you how much anxiety some of our candidates go through prior to an interview. So anything that can help someone reduce that level of anxiety and bring someone to a level where they can try and be their best version of themselves during an interview is incredibly important. And we always try and use these type of analogies with companies, because you're absolutely right. The idea of trying to do something the same for everyone is still ingrained in those organizations. It really is. But the word adjustment is a bit of a trigger word for companies still, or accommodations or equity, because I still think most of them are thinking, well, if I give someone the questions of answer, they're just going to Google it and they're just going to cheat, right? If I give someone extra time. Well, then why is that fair on someone else, right? And all this person's doing is disclosing, I've not seen a diagnosis certificate or anything like that. So we have to try and combat a lot of these biases all the time in their processes, but it's really important for companies to understand the journey that we're going on within recruitment processes and organizations now, to make sure they understand why accommodations are there and why they're so important, and why it's the only way we're going to move forward, certainly for a while, until there is the idea of universal design.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm not gonna, you really said everything there needs to be said. There's just one aspect that I do want to tackle,
Of course,
which is the requirement, or the requirement for the business in their minds, is that they have to have some sort of documentation for that individual to prove that they're neurodivergent. And legally, that's against the law. In particular, when we take a look at accommodations, you're not required to have some sort of doctor's note. The bottom line is that you legally, especially from EU standards and UK standards, is that is discriminatory, and not providing accommodations is seen as a form of discrimination, whether or not that they have that psychological report or not. And the other aspect in that regards is the barrier to get a diagnosis. I know in the UK and definitely here in Malta, there's a degree of a waiting list. There's also the aspect of, can you afford to pay for a private diagnosis? Absolutely. So when you take a look at those two aspects, there's a huge barrier to get a diagnosis. So we cannot, companies need to understand, whether whether they have the policy in place, or it's just to their lack of, frankly, ignorance in regards to what the law is, that having that diagnosis is not required to provide accommodations.
Absolutely. And the few times we've heard this, you can tell it's from a place of ignorance or lack of understanding, which obviously we address very, very quickly, because it's exactly right. We everything we do at Diversita, we never obviously ask anyone for a diagnosis. Sometimes people disclose a diagnosis, but it's not a prerequisite. And the companies that we sign agreements with understand that there's no need for any of our candidates to disclose, right? I mean, what we're doing here is working on a trust, good faith, and supportive basis to make sure that individuals get the best opportunity to project their best version of themselves during an interview process, right? So yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So Marc, at this point, I can hear people screaming at their monitors, and for me to ask this question: during the interview process, should a candidate disclose their neurodivergency?
So it's a little bit of a challenging question to answer, right? Because if it's with us, of course, right? Because we make sure that we try where possible to make sure you have an equitable candidate experience with any role you go for. Personally, if I would look at an organization individually. So if you've got 6 companies, right, do some research, right? The first thing I do before I go into any meeting with a company is Google the name and Neurodiversity and see what comes up. What are the policies on the website? What do they have in terms of case studies, or do they have employees that are disclosing? Have a look on LinkedIn and see if there's what the company is projecting and the type of information it has. If you've got some areas like LinkedIn Premium, you can have a look and see if anyone within the organization is disclosing through some searches. So it's very much individualized. Now, the only thing I would say, so for those companies where you see that type of information going through, I think I would disclose, right, and see what happens. The key upside for not disclosing, of course, is that you, with an organization that is potentially biased, is that you may get through the door. But what may happen then is you're going to encounter probably bias at one point within that organization, and the cracks will start to show if you're not given the support you need. So like I talked about earlier about the domino effect, it is more often than not a good idea to disclose and see where it goes, right? And there's some great guidelines and obviously legislation to support adjustments. Now, companies don't always adhere to that, and that's obviously an ongoing challenge, right? But so it's not a straight answer. I would say I err on the side of disclosure as opposed to not, but I can certainly understand why people don't disclose.
Yeah, I can understand too. I mean, I always advocate to disclose. And with that said, I always advocate do your homework first before you make a decision to disclose. Because as you stated, are they inclusive or not? I always suggest to them, find out somebody who works there, message them and ask them what it's like to work there. Find someone who's left and then ask them why they left. Just to give you a rounded picture. You're about to interject on that one.
No, I agree. I couldn't agree even more. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think, yeah. And even what you find, even we talked about smaller companies earlier. There's one small company we work with that were acquired by a bigger organization quite recently. And what was interesting there, they only had about 120 employees, but I think it was around 15 people had disclosed that they were neurodivergent at that company, and quite happy to talk around it on LinkedIn. And there was a variety of other people that were happy to talk about mental health challenges and other areas. So just looking at that, it's probably not perfect environment, but it's an environment where people feel comfortable to be who they are. And that was really encouraging. So yeah, homework is a key thing.
And you mentioned showing the cracks. I mean, I can just speak from my personal experience is that up until I started being a neurodiversity advocate, I never did disclose. And when I didn't, I got through the door. Getting through the door was almost never a problem for me. But once I started working in the organization, those cracks started to show. Really? And the lack of support, it had a huge mental health impact on me. And you become marginalized as a neurodivergent when there isn't that support, or when individuals or companies take advantage of you.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think it has to be an individual choice. But I think, again, this is why we feel a sense of responsibility, because the organizations we send our candidates to, again, it's not always perfect, but it's far more positive experience than it would be if they didn't go through us. Right. And I think, again, trying to make sure that we continue to not take that responsibility for granted is important to us at Diversita.
Yeah. So Marc, you mentioned earlier that you train line managers. So when collaborating with HR and hiring managers responsible for candidates interviews, what key practices do you emphasize to ensure they conduct a more inclusive interview and successfully identify the right candidates?
So if I'm looking at hiring managers in particular, it's really important that they have a foundational understanding around that candidate. And I'll give you an example. So we had a candidate relatively recently that was dyslexic, interviewing at one of our clients. Now, when this individual was asked a question, and as a lot of people will know watching this, dyslexia is predominantly around information processing. This individual had a 5-second response time, right, to a question. Now, it doesn't sound a lot, right? But if I asked you a question and then I went, it's a long time, right? That was 4 seconds. So making sure that individuals that have responsibility for hiring really take time to educate themselves, not only around neurodiversity, but also the person they're interviewing is so important. It really is. And that, again, starts with all of the things we talked about already about creating an environment where people will disclose. So when we talk to line managers, we say, look, educate yourself, but really ask questions and challenge your HR department to say, give me as much information about this candidate as you possibly can, because I'd love to know what's going to create a greater candidate experience for them, right? Now, not every adjustment or accommodation can be met, right? I understand that, right? And this is why a lot of the time the word reasonable is used, but making sure that there's an effort from that side is incredibly important. So the interview is, and again, we talked about it already, focus on skills, right? Focus around areas that the candidate wants, but also have a flexible enough interview style that you can go into different areas. Again, I don't want to lean on cliches, but there's no doubt that most individuals that are ADHD that disclose to us like to explore ideas during an interview. Right? It can go off in different areas, and time is an accommodation I always suggest to a lot of individuals with ADHD. So making sure, again, that you're pliable enough to be able to explore ideas with a candidate who's potentially ADHD. If you have someone who's autistic and they just want to talk about their skills, you focus around that area. If you have a candidate who's dyslexic and there's a pause in answering, make sure you understand that. And just think about, okay, none of this should influence my decision to hire the person. Let's focus around fundamentally, can they do this role? Can they do it to a good level? And yeah, ultimately, that should be the decision. So the interview process is really important, but it really comes down to having an empathetic, flexible approach, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And being able to adjust to the person rather than expecting the candidate to adjust to you, because that's how you're going to be able to better adjust and judge whether or not this individual is going to be the right fit for your organization, for your team.
Yes, I agree.
So lastly, Marc, you've shared with us your wonderful experience and some initial stories right off the bat. But can you share with us, Marc, one success story of a company that you guided in becoming more inclusive during the recruitment process?
There's a few. I think I won't mention the company name, but there was one that we worked with probably about a year ago now that always stands out for me. And what I liked about this company was that they had, the team itself had a neurodivergent manager, a neurodivergent leader. And we got talking, and they wanted to hire someone, right? But what was interesting there is that it was almost like a reverse process to the domino effect we're talking about, where the business were driving it, HR were maybe lacked a little bit of knowledge around what was going to be an inclusive environment. And what we did there is we had a call with the business, HR, and ourselves, where we talked quite openly around, okay, what does the recruitment process look like at the moment? Right. And then we talked about the type of changes that the business wanted to make. HR gave some quite legitimate reasons in certain instances why they couldn't make certain changes. And what we had is almost like a mediation process, which was fantastic, where we come to a solution where it was a case of HR were quite happy and understood that they needed to change. The business understood that maybe their bucket list of changes weren't going to quite happen in this instance, but it's important that we moved it forward. And then obviously this was facilitated suggestions that we say, look, other companies are doing this at the moment, and it was one of those that I wish every process could be like this, right? And now when we work with companies, we really try and drive a recruitment audit or recruitment conversation before we engage to make sure that process is as important as possible. But where we do this, we always try and get someone from the business involved. So yeah, that was really important. And what would happen then is we had a candidate who interviewed where we knew in advance, first of all, what we could say to the candidate at the qualification stage with us, what could be offered by the organization. So it wasn't a case of the candidate, we needed to go, would you like, we'll go and talk to the client and see if that's possible. We knew it was going to be possible already because we'd already engaged at a level. And this is what we try and do now. We are trying to understand our clients so well that when a candidate discloses to us, we say, look, no worries at all. We know you can get that. So don't worry about that. That's fine. And you can't underestimate the power of that. And that's what happened in this process. It was one of those utopian processes where everything just come together, but it come from the idea of collaboration, negotiation, and trying to create something where the candidate was at the center of the process. Yeah. And then from our perspective, it was perfect because we could then really, really mediate a brilliant candidate experience for the job seeker. Yeah, and they got the job, right, and been working there a year now, which is fantastic. But what happened there is they also got support afterwards, which was fantastic. So.
Amazing. And what's interesting is the dynamics that you realize that there had to be a mediation between the two parties, and you get whether it's manager or board level onto the side or somebody representing that side of things, and then getting HR and saying, okay, let's hash out what each other sees as a problem and solution, and then mediate that process where it then becomes, I think in that aspect, it kind of removes the barriers of that. It removes the barriers from both sides that this is too much of a difficult process. When through that mediation, you highlighted where it's actually not that difficult, and it became a win-win situation.
Without doubt, and I think, and look, sometimes I can be a little bit blunt and a little bit too solution driven, right, and a little bit too practical. But I think in this instance, trying to cut through bureaucracy worked quite well, but it really helped. There was an appetite to try and create a really positive candidate experience on both sides. They were just maybe looking at some of the restrictions they had on both areas. But again, a big company, right? But what was great there is that now the success of that team and the work is now being celebrated in some instances this week, right? And in various capacities. So yeah, it was a really, really positive experience. And we hope to work with more organizations in that way going forward.
Fantastic. Well, Marc, I want to express my absolute gratitude for being one of our inaugural guests, for initiating Neurodiversity Week Malta, and for providing invaluable insights for the Maltese recruitment landscape. Well, listeners, what an incredible start to Neurodiversity Week. We've commenced the event with 2 exceptional speakers and topics that will resonate throughout the week. With 4 more days ahead, if you haven't registered in the remaining events, make sure you join us tomorrow as we kick off with Simon Preston during an inclusive learning neuro ed and workplace. And Marc, you know Simon quite well.
Oh, absolute legend. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
Perfect person to talk to.
Yes, isn't he? Well, until next time, take a leap and transform.